So there's a lot of different places that we see sex trafficking in the anti-trafficking field. And I'm sure, most folks are familiar with what's called the blade or the track, right? Street sex work, where you see sex workers walking up and down the street. They may be going in and out of cars, maybe going in and out of hotels or motels. But there's also more hidden sex work, which you see brothels, massage parlors, strip clubs. These are common places where sex work is taking place as well. And then the online platforms and pornography, which for children, we call that CSAM, which is child sexual abuse materials, because it is not pornography, it's the documented abuse of a child. So CSAM, CSAM. But so this is, all of these are very difficult to determine. Is somebody there by choice? Or is there somebody sort of taking their money behind the scenes, abusing them, coercing them, and so forth, right? So this is where we get into sort of tricky territory with policies around full versus partial decriminalization. Obviously, I am in support of partial decriminalization, in which sex workers and trafficking victims are not criminalized for any sexual act, commercial sexual act. But traffickers, brothel owners, pimps, so forth, are typically the exploiter in these cases. And without, when it's fully decriminalized, they are let off the hook. So it's very, very hard to get them convicted in those cases. So So what we have seen is that the more that things are legal, right, places where sex work is legal, the illegal sex trade, juveniles and trafficking victims and people that don't want to be there, it's a lot harder for them to get help and to get out. So I'm going to jump into vulnerabilities because I think it's important to have kind of a sense of who are we talking about, right? Our clients that we're serving as clinicians, this could be anybody. And if you work with community mental health centers, if you work in jails, if you work in even schools, depending on where you are, you may be seeing some of these signs and thinking to yourself, there may be a participant in the group that I run or, in my individual practice that meets some of these criteria. Anybody can be a victim of trafficking. I was trafficked between 13 was the first incident, and then the bulk of it was between 17 and 21. I got out and I got pregnant with my son, who is going to be 19 this year. So craziness. But vulnerabilities are the name of the game here, right? So this means not that there's something wrong with me, right? That there's something inherently about me that I'm more deserving or something. When we're talking about vulnerability, we're talking more about sort of, I'm a human being riding down the street on a bicycle without a helmet. My head is vulnerable to injury, right? I put on a helmet and suddenly I've reduced that vulnerability. This is what we're talking about. So when somebody with a trauma history is put in a situation where there's a violent relationship that ultimately leads to exploitation, right? And we see this with Romeo pimps, where they will get into a relationship, try to convince the woman that they're in love with her and all of this, and then turn it around and control things and control her life and control her money. And right, it becomes very violent very quickly. This is preying on the fact that some of those red flags may not go up because that's what I'm comfortable with. My relationships in the past have all been violent, right? I have this history of trauma and maltreatment from many other deep relationships that has led to me being vulnerable to this predator. Drug addiction, having a runaway status, right? Just housing instability in general, LGBT youth and the stigma and housing instability that they may face, having a disability. Cognitive disabilities have been pretty well studied in terms of trafficking, right? That often a disabled individual with a intellectual or cognitive disability is going to be at a higher risk of being exploited. So all of this is to say, it's not because that person is disabled or because that person is, has a trauma history. It's because there hasn't been an accommodation to fill that gap. And so if those relational things aren't being worked on, if adequate accommodations for the disability and supervision aren't being provided and so forth, then there's a need that remains for that person. And a trafficker can so quickly, right? A predator senses these needs. That's like what they do. They sense the need and they come into the space and they say, hey, this is something I can provide for you if you provide these things for me. So it's important to have awareness about what you're looking for. I'm sorry, I have teenagers in my house, so making sure that folks are trying to keep it a little bit more quiet in here. So not just how to protect yourself as, a vulnerable person, but as a community member, how are we looking out for people that are in our space to help them be protected? How can I stand in that gap as a community member, as a neighbor, as a friend, as a family member, or as a provider? I'm working with a client who I see a vulnerability. How do I stand in that gap? How do I know what red flags to look out for, both as a provider and informing my clients so that they're like, oh, this does seem like a red flag, right? And also what the green flags are. So and then again, accommodations being a big piece here, we want to make sure that there's mental health treatment, there's access to safe houses when needed, that the different systems that our clients are interacting with are aware of those vulnerabilities and making accommodations for them so that there's not additional vulnerability being created by the system itself.